The first time I broke one of the rules, I didn't hear alarms or screams. I noticed an extra shadow where nothing should have been standing. I work as a supply coordinator on an offshore oil rig, and there are 11 strange rules we're told to follow if we want to finish our rotation alive. Nobody explains who wrote them, and nobody admits what happens if you ignore them. I remember laughing at the list during my first week, until a delivery arrived that wasn't on my manifest. That was the moment I realized the rules weren't meant to protect the rig. They were meant to protect us from something already here. The supply deck was quiet when the cargo ship radioed in, which already felt wrong because incoming deliveries usually came with noise, movement, and crew complaints. I was standing near the manifest table, flipping through pages I had memorized by heart, when the operator told me there were 3 additional crates being offloaded. I remember my stomach tightening because I knew every scheduled item for the next 2 weeks. As soon as I heard extra crates, Rule 1, never sign for extra crates, that arrive unscheduled echoed in my head like a warning I had ignored too many times already. I asked the operator to repeat himself, hoping I misheard, but he calmly described the crates as large, sealed, and marked only with weight numbers. No company name, no destination code, nothing that would pass a normal inspection. I could feel the eyes of the deck crew on me, waiting for instructions, and I hated how normal they looked compared to how wrong the situation felt. I thought about the laminated rule sheet in my locker and how Rule 1, never sign for extra crates that arrive unscheduled, was printed darker than the others, as if someone wanted it remembered most. I tried to stall by asking the ship for paperwork, but the response was immediate and rehearsed, telling me the documents were already transmitted. When I pulled up the system, the files were there, complete and perfect, except for the timestamps that didn't match any known server. My assistant Mark leaned over my shoulder and joked that maybe corporate was testing us, but his voice dropped when he saw my face. I told him quietly that Rule 1, never sign for extra crates that arrive unscheduled, wasn't a suggestion, even if nobody else took it seriously. Mark laughed it off and said rules like that were made by paranoid supervisors who spent too long offshore. He reminded me we'd both seen worse paperwork errors and survived them without trouble. I wanted to agree with him because agreeing would make this easier, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. The crates were already being moved closer, and I noticed the crew avoided standing directly beside them, even though nobody had said anything out loud. When the first crate passed under the deck lights, I noticed the metal surface wasn't scratched or dented like normal cargo. It looked untouched, almost too clean, as if it had never been exposed to weather or hands. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, the same feeling I got when I stayed awake too long. That was when I remembered the handwritten note beneath Rule 1, never sign for extra crates that arrive unscheduled, the one that said delays were safer than acceptance. I radioed the rig supervisor and explained the situation, careful not to sound alarmed even though my hands were shaking. He was silent longer than usual before asking how many crates there were and whether they were already on board. When I told him they were still on the crane, he exhaled slowly and told me not to touch anything yet. His tone changed completely when he repeated Rule 1, never sign for extra crates that arrive unscheduled, as if saying it out loud made it real again. Mark rolled his eyes and muttered that everyone was overreacting, then stepped forward to inspect one of the crates himself. I grabbed his arm without thinking, and he snapped at me to let go, drawing attention from the crew. I told him the rule existed for a reason, but he shrugged and said rules didn't pay bonuses or keep schedules intact. The moment he placed his hand on the crate, I felt something shift, like the air itself had leaned closer. The crane operator reported a brief system delay, and the crate stopped mid-air, swaying slightly above the deck. Nobody spoke, but all of us watched as condensation began forming along the metal seams, despite the warm night air. Mark pulled his hand back slowly and asked if anyone else felt dizzy, trying to laugh it off. I didn't answer because I was staring at a faint indentation appearing on the crate's side, as if something inside was pressing outward. I ordered the operator to halt the offload completely, citing safety protocol, and for once nobody argued. The supervisor came down in person, his face pale, and told everyone to clear the deck except essential crew. As the area emptied, he leaned close and whispered that the last coordinator, who ignored Rule 1, never signed for extra crates that arrive unscheduled, had resigned mid-rotation without explanation. He never told anyone why, and nobody ever saw him board the helicopter. The ship's captain began insisting over the radio that the crates had to be delivered immediately, his voice growing sharper with every refusal. I noticed that the signal quality degraded the longer he spoke, words stretching and overlapping unnaturally. The supervisor cut the channel and told me to prepare a refusal report, even though corporate would not like it. That was when the lights above the deck flickered and the crate nearest to us made a subtle shift against its restraints. Mark whispered that maybe we should just sign for them and get it over with, his earlier confidence gone completely. I told him that breaking Rule 1, never sign for extra crates that arrive unscheduled, wasn't something you fixed afterward. The supervisor agreed and said we were done talking about it, but his eyes never left the crates. As we started backing away, I noticed one final detail that made my blood run cold. The weight markings on the crates had changed, each number slowly updating on its own, counting down instead of up. The countdown on the crate nearest to us kept updating even after the deck lights stabilized, and I could feel my heart sinking with the slow drop of the numbers. Nobody spoke at first, because we were all pretending not to notice it, like looking away might undo what we'd already seen. The supervisor finally told me to log the anomaly and step back, but my eyes stayed locked on the shifting digits. I remembered reading Rule 2, never count the crates, after the numbers start changing, and how vague it sounded until that exact moment. As we retreated toward the inner door, the crane operator asked over the internal channel if he should secure the load or return it to the ship. The supervisor hesitated, which scared me more than a wrong decision would have. I could tell he was mentally flipping through the same rules I was, trying to remember which one applied next. When he finally said to hold position, I knew we were already drifting closer to breaking Rule 2. Never count the crates after the numbers start changing without realizing it. Mark leaned in beside me and whispered that the numbers didn't make sense, that they weren't stopping at 0. I told him not to focus on them, but his eyes kept flicking back, like something was pulling his attention. He started quietly counting under his breath, not the numbers on the crate, but the crates themselves. I grabbed his arm again and told him to stop, reminding him that Rule 2, never count the crates after the numbers start changing, applied to more than just paperwork. He snapped back that counting crates wasn't the same thing, that I was letting superstition get the better of me. I wanted to argue, but the truth was, I didn't know where the line actually was. The rules never explained consequences directly, only patterns of survival written by people who hadn't stuck around to clarify. As Mark reached 3, the lights dimmed slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough that everyone noticed. The supervisor ordered Mark to step away from the railing, his voice tight with a kind of fear I hadn't heard from him before. Mark laughed nervously and said he was just trying to keep busy, but his foot tapped against the deck like he couldn't stay still. I could see sweat forming at his hairline, even though the air was cool. I told him again that Rule 2, never count the crates after the numbers start changing, wasn't optional, even if it didn't make sense yet. The radio crackled with a delayed transmission from the cargo ship, repeating the same request to complete delivery. This time, the voice didn't sound annoyed or rushed. It sounded patient, like it knew time was on its side. The supervisor muted the channel and told us to ignore it, but I noticed his hand hovering near the emergency alarm without pressing it. The countdown on the crate paused for a moment, then skipped several numbers at once. Mark suddenly said there were more crates than before, his voice low and confused. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop when I realized he was right. The deck layout hadn't changed, but the spacing between the crates felt wrong, like something had been added without moving anything else. I forced myself not to count, repeating Rule 2, never count the crates, after the numbers start changing in my head like a prayer. The supervisor told us not to look directly at them anymore, instructing everyone to turn toward the inner wall. I complied immediately, but Mark hesitated, his eyes darting back one last time. He said he just needed to be sure, just needed to know how many there were now. Before I could stop him, he whispered a number, and the air around us seemed to thicken, like breathing through resistance. The lights above the deck brightened suddenly, and for a brief second, I saw a reflection in the crate's metal that didn't match our positions. It looked like too many silhouettes standing where only a few of us were. My ears felt full, and my vision blurred at the edges, but I kept my face turned away. I remembered the note beneath Rule 2, never count the crates after the numbers start changing, the one that said curiosity creates inventory. Mark staggered backward, pressing his hands to his head, saying the count wouldn't stay still. He said every time he reached the end, another crate appeared at the beginning, like the deck was looping. The supervisor shouted at him to stop talking about it, to stop thinking about it, but Mark's breathing grew uneven. I moved toward him, ignoring the fear crawling up my spine. I told Mark to look at me, not at the crates, and to repeat my words instead of numbers. He tried, but his eyes kept sliding past my shoulder, tracking something I couldn't see. He said the crates were closer now, even though none of us had moved them. When he said that, the countdown resumed, faster this time, and I felt a deep vibration through the deck beneath my boots. The supervisor made the call to initiate partial lockdown, sealing off the outer deck. As the heavy door began to close, I heard Mark ask what happens when the numbers reach the end. Nobody answered him, because none of us knew what the end was supposed to look like. I thought about Rule 2, never count the crates after the numbers start changing, and how it never said what would happen if you did. Mark suddenly pulled free from my grip and took a step toward the crates, saying he needed to fix it. The supervisor shouted his name, but Mark didn't slow down. I saw his reflection distort across the metal surface as he approached, like the crate couldn't decide how to show him. The countdown froze the moment he got close enough to touch it again. Before he could make contact, the inner door slammed shut behind us, separating him from the rest of us. The supervisor stared at the sealed door in horror, realizing too late that lockdown protocols didn't account for people left outside. Over the intercom, Mark's voice came through, calm now, telling us the count was complete. That was when I realized Rule 2, never count the crates after the numbers start changing, wasn't about numbers at all. The supervisor slowly turned to me and asked how many rules we had left. I told him there were 9 more, but my voice shook when I said it. Through the reinforced window, I could see the crates shifting slightly, rearranging themselves around Mark. The countdown display went dark, and something new began appearing in its place. It looked like a manifest being written from the inside. The air on the deck had grown heavier after the manifest started writing itself, and I could feel a weight pressing down on my shoulders as I approached the nearest crate. The supervisor and I exchanged a look, both understanding why Rule 3, never open a crate without 2 witnesses present, existed, though neither of us wanted to test it. Mark was still trapped outside the inner door, his shadow stretched and distorted by the floodlights, silently staring at the crates like he could coax them open with his mind. I swallowed hard, wishing for any normal distraction, but there was none. The hum of machinery had become a low, almost sentient pulse beneath our feet. I suggested calling in the remaining deck crew for witnesses, but half of them were already frozen on the edges of the deck, unwilling to come closer. The supervisor agreed reluctantly, instructing us to keep our eyes on the manifest as it continued to shift, now listing items none of us had ever seen. As the crew gathered, I noticed how their reflections warped across the crate's polished surfaces, multiplying and bending like water ripples, making it impossible to judge the actual number of people present. I reminded myself that Rule 3, never open a crate without 2 witnesses present, wasn't about ceremony, it was about survival, and that realization made my hands tremble against the steel railing. Once everyone was in place, the supervisor motioned for me to unlock the first crate. My key turned slowly, the metal grinding louder than expected, though no machinery was near. As the lock clicked, I felt a sudden cold draft brush past me, carrying with it the faint scent of something metallic yet alive. One of the crew muttered, "Did anyone else feel that?" But nobody answered, their eyes glued to the crate, as if it held a secret meant only for us. I focused on keeping my breathing steady, knowing that Rule 3, never open a crate without 2 witnesses present, was the only thing standing between us and whatever might be inside. The lid began to rise with surprising ease, revealing an interior that seemed impossibly dark, deeper than the deck below. It smelled like wet concrete and rust, though there was no water inside, and I caught movement at the very bottom, shadows that weren't ours. The crew stiffened, and someone whispered that it looked like a hole into another dimension, though I knew better than to speak thoughts like that aloud. I realized at that moment that Rule 3, never open a crate without 2 witnesses present, wasn't just precautionary, it was a boundary, one the manifest could bend if ignored. As the crate opened fully, a low vibration traveled up my spine, like the deck itself was breathing in sync with whatever waited inside. I could feel the temperature drop sharply, each of us instinctively huddling closer together for warmth, or maybe for courage. The supervisor signaled me to look inside, and I froze when I saw movement that mimicked our own gestures, perfectly timed, as though the crate was watching and learning us. I could sense Mark's shadow pressing against the reinforced window from the other side, staring, and I realized too late that witnessing wasn't just about numbers. One of the crew members, a young engineer named Luis, stepped back suddenly, shouting that he saw something crawl along the side of the crate, though there was nothing there. The supervisor grabbed his arm, urging calm, but I could feel a ripple of fear spreading, infecting even the bravest among us. The crate seemed almost alive now, edges pulsating with a faint metallic sheen, and I struggled to keep my composure. The shadows inside writhed, responding to our presence, and for a moment I understood why Rule 3, never open a crate without 2 witnesses present, had been written, not to protect the cargo, but to protect us from whatever acknowledged our curiosity. Suddenly, the crate emitted a faint hum, low and rhythmic, matching the pulse I'd felt through the deck earlier. It grew louder, like a heartbeat, filling the space between the steel walls with something I couldn't identify, vibrating against my chest and teeth. The supervisor ordered everyone to step back, but our reflections in the crate's polished surface now multiplied infinitely, overlaying onto one another in impossible ways. I could feel a mental tug, as though the crate wanted me to reach inside, to touch, to confirm its presence. I stepped back, forcing myself to focus on the fact that there were 2 witnesses here, keeping the rule intact, keeping us alive. Yet even with the rule followed, the crate seemed to exhale, and a faint whisper of names brushed against my consciousness. I didn't recognize all of them, but one of them was mine. I stumbled, gripping the railing, and the supervisor caught me just in time, muttering under his breath about ignoring the rules. The crew remained silent, eyes fixed on the crate, as if acknowledging that any movement now could be fatal. Then the lid began to close on its own, not slowly, but like it had never been fully lifted. The shadows inside disappeared, leaving only an empty darkness that seemed to swallow the deck lights. I realized with a sickening certainty that Rule 3, never open a crate without 2 witnesses present, didn't guarantee safety. It merely delayed the inevitable. Mark's silhouette pressed against the glass outside the inner door, silent now, watching as the crate reorganized itself, as if it had absorbed our actions. The supervisor muttered something about time limits, and I could feel the pulse through the deck intensify again. By the time the lid sealed completely, the manifests had changed again, listing items none of us recognized and some that didn't even exist. The supervisor's hands shook as he locked down the remaining crates, glancing at the inner door and muttering that the witness requirement might be the only reason we were all still breathing. I stood there, feeling the weight of the first 2 rules pressing in, the unscheduled crates and the unseen counting, and I knew we hadn't even scratched the surface of what was coming. Outside, Mark's shadow began moving differently, as if detached from his body, creeping along the walls in impossible angles. My stomach knotted, and I knew the next rule would decide whether we stayed alive, or whether the crate's whispers would finally reach through the steel walls. I swallowed hard and looked at the supervisor, who nodded grimly, signaling that it was time to face whatever came next. Even after the lids had sealed, the air on the deck remained charged, almost alive, vibrating subtly under my boots. I could feel it pressing against the back of my neck, urging me to glance away. But I remembered Rule 4, never turn your back on the crates, and forced myself to stay facing them. Mark's shadow still lingered against the inner door, moving unnaturally, like it was stretching longer than it should. The supervisor kept his hands tight on the railing, whispering about how the crates reacted to movement and presence. I knew instinctively that even a second of distraction could cost us everything. We began organizing the deck for the night, but every task felt secondary to the weight of the sealed crates behind us. I caught the reflection of our lights shifting strangely on the metal surfaces, and it seemed the crates were slowly repositioning themselves, adjusting to our presence. The supervisor muttered that the rules weren't just guidelines, they were active, almost sentient. I nodded silently, gripping the edge of a crate, my knuckles whitening as I repeated in my head, Rule 4, never turn your back on the crates. Mark finally shouted from behind the glass, insisting that the shadows were creeping forward, but none of us could respond without risking breaking the rule. I watched the crates carefully, while one of the engineers nervously adjusted a crate's restraint cable. The reflection of his movements was delayed, like the metal had absorbed his image and was replaying it seconds later. My chest tightened as I realized the rule wasn't about just standing and watching. It was about anticipating. Any lapse might invite something we couldn't see to step closer. The vibration through the deck intensified, and I felt a prickling sensation along my spine, like tiny needles pressing against my skin. I could hear the faint hum of machinery, or perhaps it wasn't machinery at all, blending into a rhythm that matched my pulse. The supervisor whispered that when the crates sensed inattention, they tested the boundaries of observation. I focused on my breathing, keeping my gaze locked on the nearest crate. Rule 4, never turn your back on the crates, wasn't merely about eyes, it was about presence, and I had never felt more aware of every subtle shift around me. Suddenly, one crate shifted slightly on its own, a whisper of metal against metal that made everyone freeze. The supervisor's eyes widened as he barked instructions to step back, but I stayed rooted, counting every second of the movement, refusing to break the rule. Mark's shadow flinched behind the glass, and I noticed it moved in ways his body shouldn't have allowed, curling and stretching with the crate's motion. I swallowed hard, realizing that Rule 4, never turn your back on the crates, wasn't just about physical orientation, it was about acknowledgement. The night deepened, and the wind from the sea carried a low, almost imperceptible vibration that made the deck sway in sympathy. Every time I glanced at the other crew members, they seemed to be half lost in their own fears, but I forced myself to keep watching. I couldn't let instinct push me into turning around for reassurance, because the crates would know instantly. The supervisor muttered again, "It feeds on neglect," and I shivered, understanding what he meant. Rule 4, never turn your back on the crates, wasn't about punishment, it was about survival. A sudden movement in the corner of my vision nearly made me flinch, but I forced my body rigid and kept staring straight ahead. The crate's reflections shimmered in a way that didn't match the lights, almost like ripples on water. Mark's shadow flickered erratically, and I realized he wasn't just standing, he was interacting with something invisible, something the crates had already noticed. I told myself that turning away for even a second might give it an opening. The pressure of observation was exhausting, but breaking Rule 4, never turn your back on the crates, was not an option. The supervisor called out a status check over the radio, and the sound carried strangely, distant and warped. I could see the reflection of the radio's light in the metal, but it didn't match the rhythm of his voice. My mind struggled to focus, my body begging for a glance elsewhere, but I forced myself to track the crate's edges with every flicker of the deck lights. The sense of being watched had intensified, and it was clear that the crates weren't passive, they anticipated, reacted, and tested. The minutes dragged into hours, and the vibrations seemed to sync with my heartbeat. rising and falling like tides. Mark finally pressed his hand to the glass and mouthed something I couldn't hear, his shadow twitching unnaturally. I realized that even the slightest motion in our absence was mirrored by the crates, a silent record of attention. One of the engineers, eyes wide, whispered that he thought a crate had moved closer to us. I didn't respond, because I couldn't risk turning. I simply repeated in my head, Rule 4, never turn your back on the crates. Then a faint metallic echo resonated through the deck, subtle but undeniable. I noticed that all reflections of the crew in the crates now had extra limbs, small distortions that appeared when we weren't looking directly at them. My pulse raced as the supervisor pulled me aside and muttered that the rule only worked if you stayed completely aware. One misstep, one blink, and the crates would know exactly how to act. I realized with a creeping dread that Rule 4, never turn your back on the crates, wasn't just a rule, it was a constant test, and we were dangerously close to failing it. The night pressed on, oppressive and silent, except for the soft hum beneath our feet. Every second that passed without a misstep felt like a small victory, but the weight of vigilance was exhausting. I could feel the edge of my focus fraying, the pull of exhaustion urging me to glance elsewhere, but I stayed rigid, eyes locked on the nearest crate, as the supervisor muttered under his breath, "Just don't look away." I understood then, fully and terrifyingly, that if I broke Rule 4, never turn your back on the crates, nothing would prepare me for what came next. The morning fog rolled over the rig, and the deck felt colder than it should, despite the rising sun. I stood motionless, staring at the crates, remembering the pulse from last night, and the strange shadows that lingered even after I blinked. The supervisor kept glancing nervously at me, muttering that Rule 5, never speak the crate's number aloud, was the most ignored one in history, and that saying it could bring attention we didn't want. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain silent, even when the manifest shifted before us, the numbers changing again like they had a mind of their own. Mark's shadow pressed against the glass of the inner door, twitching in patterns that didn't match his body, and I could feel the tension rising in the crew around me. Louis, the young engineer, kept whispering under his breath, trying to guess the numbers, and I had to grip his shoulder to stop him. The numbers on the crate weren't fixed. They flowed, sliding across surfaces, like liquid metal, impossible to track without falling into temptation. I reminded him silently of Rule 5, never speak the crate's number aloud, though no one had actually heard me. The supervisor motioned for everyone to move to the inner deck, while I stayed behind to monitor the crates. Every shift of the numbers seemed to resonate, a subtle vibration that tickled the back of my throat and made me want to call them out just to prove I was in control. I knew better. Speaking aloud even one digit could be catastrophic. I could feel the pull of curiosity, like the numbers themselves were whispering my name, teasing me, daring me to break Rule 5, never speak the crate's number aloud. The crates began to vibrate gently, almost imperceptibly, and I felt the air thicken around them. Each digit, each pulse of the manifest, seemed to hum with life, like it was aware of our every move. Mark's shadow darted again, now fully separate from his physical form, reaching toward the crates in slow, deliberate motions. I clenched my fists and forced my voice into silence, repeating the rule in my head, trying to resist the urge to say a single number aloud. Suddenly, one crate's surface shimmered, displaying a sequence of numbers that twisted and bent in ways impossible to read. My stomach dropped, because the crate's manifestation seemed almost sentient, watching our reactions. I noticed Louis inching closer, murmuring under his breath, as if trying to confirm the sequence. I grabbed his wrist and shook him firmly, whispering, "Remember Rule 5, never speak the crate's number aloud." His eyes widened, and he nodded, but I could see the fear creeping into every muscle of his body. The supervisor warned that the numbers responded to attention, and the more we acknowledged them, the faster they multiplied. I realized then that the crates were testing us, gauging our control over ourselves. One misstep, Just saying a number aloud would trigger something beyond comprehension. Mark's shadow on the glass stretched further, bending in impossible angles as if urging us to slip, to succumb. I gritted my teeth and kept my gaze fixed on the nearest crate, heart hammering, praying no one would falter. The deck seemed to contract, the vibrations intensifying with every heartbeat. I could feel the crates shifting subtly, not physically, but in perception, like they were bending reality around themselves. The numbers writhed in front of me, forming patterns I couldn't comprehend, but could sense were meaningful. I whispered nothing, my voice locked away, forcing myself to endure the temptation, because breaking Rule 5, never speak the crate's number aloud, wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. Suddenly the crate closest to me pulsed once, sharply, and I felt the floor vibrate beneath my boots. The numbers on its surface twisted into a new sequence, faster this time, impossible to track, almost teasing me. Mark's shadow pressed flat against the glass as if trying to warn me, his fingers twitching in panic. I realized the rule wasn't just about verbal acknowledgement, it was about existence itself. The numbers were alive, and speaking them aloud would invite them into our reality fully. A faint whisper brushed my consciousness, like someone speaking from far away, but the sound had no source. I tried to ignore it, to keep my mind from wandering to the temptation of calling out digits. The supervisor kept glancing nervously at me, signaling for patience, and I could feel every crew member holding their breath. I realized then that Rule 5, never speak the crate's number aloud, demanded absolute control, because the crates observed every internal thought as keenly as our outward actions. Minutes dragged into hours, each second heavier than the last. The numbers continued their silent dance, impossible to follow, and every vibration in the deck reminded me that they were aware. Louis twitched nervously, and I had to silently restrain him, willing him to follow the rule. Outside, Mark's shadow writhed in strange patterns against the glass, like it was warning us that a single mistake could unravel everything. I clenched my fists, repeating in my head, over and over, Rule 5, never speak the crate's number aloud, knowing that even uttering it internally was an act of defiance if I didn't hold it tightly in thought. Then, without warning, one of the crates shifted closer to the inner deck, a movement subtle yet impossible to ignore. The manifest updated instantly, numbers streaming faster than I could comprehend. I realized that this was the test to see if we could resist, to see if silence and vigilance could hold back whatever resided inside. The pulse beneath my feet quickened, echoing the rise in my heartbeat, and I understood, terrifyingly, that Rule 5, never speak the crate's number aloud, had kept the first disaster at bay, but only for now. The fog had lifted slightly, but the deck felt heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on us. I stayed close to the supervisor, refusing to let myself drift even a step away, because Rule 6, never approach a crate alone, had an unspoken weight I'd felt, but never understood fully until that morning. Mark's shadow had receded slightly behind the inner door, but it still moved with an unnatural autonomy, stretching and curling against the reinforced glass. Every vibration beneath my boots reminded me that the crates were aware of every inch we moved, tracking our isolation like predators. I glanced at the nearest crate, its surface gleaming in the rising sun, and felt a pulse of dread ripple through me. Luis, the engineer, lingered too close to a crate, seemingly entranced by the shifting metal surface. I grabbed his arm before he could step closer and pulled him back, warning him quietly, Rule 6, never approach a crate alone. His eyes widened in sudden realization, and he nodded, moving closer to the supervisor. I felt a brief relief, though it was fragile, because the crate nearest us seemed to ripple, as if acknowledging his proximity, like it had been waiting for a lapse in our vigilance. The shadows inside the crates moved subtly, almost imperceptibly, but I could sense them adjusting to our formation. The supervisor motioned for me to check the restraining cables on the crates, while he and Luis watched, a forced calm in his voice. As I stepped closer, I could feel the air thicken, pressing against my chest, making each step feel like wading through a dense fog. I reminded myself of the rule, Rule 6, never approach a crate alone, and kept my gaze locked on the nearest crate, scanning for any subtle shift in its metal. My hand hovered over the cable lock, and I noticed the faint distortion of the metal, as if something beneath was responding to my presence. Mark's shadow twitched on the other side of the glass, mimicking my movements, but with a delay that felt wrong. I shivered, realizing that isolation was dangerous, not just physically, but perceptually. The crates seemed to know when one of us was separate from the group, testing boundaries we didn't even know existed. As I secured the first cable, I could see a slight vibration along the edges of the crate, like it was breathing. Every instinct screamed that the moment I tried this alone, even for a few seconds, the crate would reach for me in ways we couldn't predict. The supervisor instructed Luis to hold the flashlight on the crate while I worked, ensuring 2 sets of eyes were always on me. I could feel the tension mounting, a tight coil of nerves that made my hands shake, despite my efforts. Every time I glanced at the other crates, I noticed subtle shifts, almost like reflections that shouldn't exist, bending the lines of reality around them. I gritted my teeth, aware that Rule 6, never approach a crate alone, was more than a guideline. It was a buffer against something that was constantly probing, testing, learning. A sudden metallic hum resonated through the deck, low and vibrating, and I froze mid-action, knowing it wasn't ordinary machinery. The vibration pulsed in rhythm with the crate's reflections, like they were alive, sensing, reacting to our collective presence. The supervisor whispered that the moment anyone strayed alone, the crates would begin selecting, choosing who would interact next. I could feel the weight of his warning, the unspoken history of crew members who had ignored this rule, and I tightened my grip on the cable, refusing to move a single step unaccompanied. Luis shifted nervously, trying to adjust the flashlight, and I noticed his reflection twist in ways the other crew members' reflections did not. The supervisor kept close, muttering under his breath that even the shadows of the crew mattered to the crates. I could sense a subtle tug, like the nearest crate wanted me alone, reaching out imperceptibly through the vibrations in the metal and air. My pulse raced, and I reminded myself silently, Rule 6, never approach a crate alone, because any lapse, however brief, might invite the crate's attention. The shadows in the crate nearest us flickered, forming vague shapes that resembled stretched hands or reaching limbs. I held my breath, aware that the tension was testing our attention, forcing us to maintain proximity. Every subtle vibration or distortion felt like an intelligence trying to read our intentions, and I realized that stepping alone, even for a second, would have made me a target. The supervisor whispered for me to finish quickly, but I moved methodically, fully aware that Rule 6, never approach a crate alone, wasn't about procedure, it was about survival. As I completed the final cable check, the crate seemed to settle slightly, almost as if satisfied by the enforced attention. I exhaled quietly, relieved to be moving back toward the group, but the hum persisted, and the shadows danced in impossible ways along the metal edges. I realized the rule had kept us from immediate danger, but it hadn't calmed whatever presence lingered within the crates. Mark's shadow pressed flat against the glass, watching intently, and I sensed that Rule 6 had bought us only temporary safety. The supervisor nodded at me, signaling the crew to regroup, but the vibration beneath our feet intensified, sharper, faster. I noticed one crate slightly closer to the inner deck, its polished metal reflecting distortions that hadn't been there a moment ago. I realized with a sinking feeling that the rules were cumulative. The more we obeyed, the more they demanded. And in that moment, I understood that Rule 6, never approach a crate alone, had just reminded us that vigilance could never be paused, because the crates were always learning, always waiting. The fog had lifted completely now, revealing the rig in stark morning light, but the tension hadn't eased at all. I hovered near my assigned crates, keeping my hands close to my body, and reminded myself that Rule 7, never touch a crate that isn't assigned to you, was more than a guideline. It was a boundary I couldn't afford to cross. Mark's shadow lingered beyond the glass, its motion still unnaturally independent, and I could feel the collective unease of the crew pressing down like a weight. Even at a distance, the unassigned crates seemed to hum faintly, vibrating subtly, as if aware of our glances. Every instinct screamed that proximity was dangerous, that any temptation to reach forward could have consequences we didn't yet understand. The supervisor moved deliberately beside me, ensuring no one strayed near crates that weren't theirs. I noticed Luis's gaze lingering on a crate farther down the deck, his curiosity obvious in the way he shifted from foot to foot. I grabbed his arm quickly and whispered, "Remember Rule 7, never touch a crate that isn't assigned to you." His eyes widened, and he nodded quickly, stepping back as if the crate had lunged at him in acknowledgement. Even without physical contact, the crate seemed to react to our intentions, a subtle vibration moving through the deck like a silent warning. I began checking my assigned crates systematically, the supervisor watching closely, counting every twist and turn of the cable locks. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of the unassigned crates shifting slightly, like they were testing boundaries, probing for any careless hand. The shadows inside them flickered in rhythm with our movements, responding almost instantly to our collective attention. I felt my chest tighten, aware that a single lapse, a momentary curiosity, could draw attention from the unassigned crates, and perhaps from something far worse within them. Mark's shadow twitched unnaturally, stretching and curling as if trying to reach across the deck. I reminded myself again to keep distance, to respect the rules silently, because Rule 7, never touch a crate that isn't assigned to you, wasn't just about protocol, it was about survival. The vibrations beneath my boots seemed to grow heavier when I inadvertently glanced too long at a crate that didn't belong to me. Even observing it closely felt dangerous, as if the crate was aware of not just physical contact, but intent itself. The supervisor called out reminders for everyone to stay focused, his voice tight with urgency. I noticed Luis shifting uneasily, and I could see the reflection of his hands stretching strangely across the nearest crate, as if they had a mind of their own. I knew that if anyone made contact with a crate that wasn't theirs, the rules wouldn't stop the consequences from reaching us. I tightened my grip on my cable lock, deliberately ignoring the subtle metallic pulse emanating from the nearest unassigned crate. A sudden low hum traveled across the deck, synchronized with a faint vibration in the crates, almost like they were sharing awareness. The shadows inside the unassigned crates stretched and shifted in patterns that didn't match the crew, and I realized the rule wasn't just to keep us from harm, it was to prevent something inside the crates from interacting with us. I reminded myself silently, Rule 7, never touch a crate that isn't assigned to you, and focused on the crate I was responsible for, counting each lock and hinge meticulously. Luis leaned too close again, peering at an unassigned crate, and I grabbed his shoulder with urgency. "Step back," I hissed, and his eyes widened as the crate responded subtly, a distortion moving along its surface. Even the slightest touch or proximity seemed to awaken it, and I realized with a chill that the crate didn't need to be open to interact with you. It only needed acknowledgement. The supervisor's shadow remained close, a silent reminder that we were only safe if we followed this rule without hesitation. As I finished securing my assigned crates, a sudden shift in the unassigned ones drew my eyes despite my best efforts. The reflections twisted, forming shapes that resembled reaching hands and moving faces, almost human but impossibly wrong. I held my position, aware that breaking Rule 7, never touch a crate that isn't assigned to you, was as much about restraint as it was about survival. My pulse raced, and I felt the presence behind the glass and metal more strongly than ever, as if it was evaluating every minor lapse in attention. The supervisor instructed the crew to retreat to a safe perimeter around their assigned crates, while he monitored the unassigned ones. Every subtle movement of the unassigned crates sent tremors through the deck, synchronized with our nervous glances. I kept my hands firmly by my sides, resisting the urge to reach out just to confirm their solidity. Even a brief touch, even the intention alone, seemed enough to provoke them. I repeated silently in my mind, Rule 7. Never touch a crate that isn't assigned to you, aware that the consequences were waiting, invisible and immediate. The shadows in the crates continued their impossible movements, bending in ways that defied physics. The vibrations beneath our feet intensified gradually, like the crates themselves were breathing. I realized that our obedience wasn't just a safety measure, it was a deterrent, keeping the entities within the crates from selecting a target. Mark's shadow pressed flat against the glass once more, motionless but watching, a reminder that proximity and vigilance were everything. I knew that breaking Rule 7 would have consequences far beyond a reprimand. It could trigger an event we wouldn't survive. Finally, the supervisor gave a quiet nod, signaling that our checks were complete. The vibration subsided slightly, though the hum lingered, and the unassigned crates seemed to settle back into a deceptive calm. I exhaled, feeling a momentary relief, but I knew it was fragile. The crates hadn't forgotten, hadn't forgiven curiosity or carelessness. Rule 7. Never touch a crate that isn't assigned to you had protected us again, but I knew that the next test was waiting, ready to push us further, and I braced myself for it. By late afternoon, the rig was bathed in the orange glow of a sinking sun, yet the deck felt unnaturally quiet, almost suffocating. I kept my eyes locked on my assigned crates, but every now and then, a faint metallic creak or subtle vibration whispered from the unassigned ones. The supervisor muttered that Rule 8, never ignore strange sounds from the crates, was critical because the noises often preceded the inexplicable. I could hear Mark's shadow moving along the glass behind the inner door, its distorted motions twitching in rhythm with the faint sounds. My stomach tightened as I realized the sounds weren't random. They were deliberate, testing us, beckoning attention we weren't supposed to give. Luis, the engineer, flinched as a low hum resonated through the deck, his flashlight trembling in his hand. I grabbed it and steadied his grip, whispering to him, "Do not ignore it, watch carefully, but do not respond." The supervisor nodded beside me, emphasizing that acknowledging the sound mentally was not enough. We had to analyze it, track it, without giving in to instinct. The hum had a rhythm, almost conversational, like it was attempting to communicate through vibration and resonance. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, realizing that these were no ordinary noises. The crates had awareness, and Rule 8 was our line between observation and disaster. Suddenly, a faint tapping began, almost like fingernails dragging along metal, echoing from one of the unassigned crates. My first instinct was to move closer, to see, but I remembered the rules, specifically Rule 8, never ignore strange sounds from the crates. I signaled to Luis and the supervisor, keeping our eyes fixed on the crates while noting the source. The tapping grew slightly louder, yet remained subtle, deliberate, almost as if the crate itself was drawing patterns in the metal. Every nerve in my body screamed to retreat, but doing so without observing would break the rule just as surely as stepping too close. The supervisor instructed me to record the pattern of the sounds, using a handheld device to log vibrations and echoes. I could hear my own heartbeat mingling with the low hum of the crates, a rhythm that seemed to respond directly to my fear. The vibrations beneath our boots intensified subtly, as if the crates were not just producing sound, but communicating through it, synchronizing with our presence. I reminded myself silently, Rule 8, never ignore strange sounds from the crates, knowing that failure to pay attention could allow whatever lurked inside to act undetected. Mark's shadow twitched suddenly, drawn toward the faint tapping, its movements unhuman, curling and stretching, as though it could merge with the sound itself. I shivered, understanding that the entity beyond the glass responded to both motion and awareness. The unassigned crate seemed to hum in harmony with Mark's shadow, almost as if acknowledging him, though he remained outside. I focused on recording each variation, each subtle creak, understanding that careful attention was the only defense we had. A sudden scrape echoed across the deck, louder and more deliberate, originating from a crate I hadn't noticed moving before. The vibration beneath my boots intensified immediately, resonating through my chest. I watched the crate's reflections twist unnaturally, shadows forming angles that defied logic. I knew instinctively that Rule 8, never ignore strange sounds from the crates, was not merely about perception. It was about survival, keeping us prepared for whatever would happen the moment the sound culminated. Luis's hands shook as he recorded the sounds, his flashlight flickering slightly. I could see the shadows inside the crates shifting in response to the vibrations, moving like liquid across the polished metal. The supervisor whispered that past crews who ignored these auditory warnings had vanished without trace. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, realizing that these sounds were testing our attentiveness, measuring every hesitation. Obedience to Rule 8 was our only protection against the unseen consequences. Then a faint murmur reached my ears, almost human, almost urgent, emanating from the crate nearest us. It was unintelligible, yet somehow clear, as if attempting to communicate. I forced myself not to respond aloud, keeping the supervisor and Luis between me and the crate, maintaining vigilance. The vibration in the deck beneath us rose with intensity, as though the crate was synchronizing with the murmur and with us. I understood with a creeping dread that ignoring or misinterpreting these sounds would invite consequences we could not survive. The supervisor signaled for us to maintain a tight perimeter while we continued recording. I noted each subtle variation, each fluctuation, aware that the sounds were almost sentient, reacting to our attention. The shadows inside the crates twisted in ways that mirrored the noises, forming impossible shapes, stretching across surfaces and patterns that defied physics. I realized that the crate was alive in a way we couldn't measure, and that Rule 8, never ignore strange sounds from the crates, was the fragile tether keeping it from acting against us. Minutes passed, each one heavier than the last, as the hums, taps, and murmurs continued, persistent and probing. Every time I felt my attention falter, the vibrations intensified, a reminder that the crates were aware of the slightest lapse. I could see Mark's shadow shift unnaturally, almost reaching into the crate as though drawn to the sounds. I tightened my grip on my recording device and focused, silently repeating Rule 8, never ignore strange sounds from the crates, knowing that understanding the sounds could be the difference between surviving the night or disappearing without a trace. Night had fully fallen over the rig, and the deck lights cast long, wavering shadows across the crates. I could feel the vibrations beneath my boots more intensely than ever, as if the rig itself was alive and aware of our every movement. The supervisor whispered that Rule 9, never attempt to move a crate without backup, existed because crates had a way of retaliating when isolated. Mark's shadow shifted beyond the inner glass, stretching impossibly long, watching us with a patience that felt deliberate, almost predatory. I gritted my teeth and refused to approach any crate alone, aware that the rule wasn't about strength. It was about safety from something far smarter than us. Luis nervously suggested moving a smaller crate to access the manifest, but I shook my head, reminding him silently of Rule 9, never attempt to move a crate without backup. The supervisor nodded gravely, motioning that 2 crew members should accompany any movement, or it should be left untouched entirely. Even the tiniest crate seemed to resist, humming faintly with energy that responded to proximity and intention. I watched as one of the unassigned crates quivered slightly, almost in anticipation, and I realized that these objects weren't passive. They were aware, measuring every intention we had. The vibration intensified as I moved closer to my assigned crate to check the locks, careful not to disturb others. The supervisor kept his hand near my shoulder, signaling that we needed constant vigilance. Even though we weren't touching unassigned crates, their presence was palpable, reacting subtly to our actions. I felt my pulse quicken when I noticed a slight shift in one crate's shadow, a distortion that didn't match the rest of the reflections on the deck. The rule existed because once a crate sensed isolation, it could act in ways that no physical restraint could stop. Mark's shadow flickered unnaturally against the inner door, mimicking movements that none of us had made, bending in impossible ways. I shivered, aware that the shadow and the crates were connected in some unexplainable way. The supervisor instructed us to check all cable restraints before any lifting could happen. ensuring 2 or more people were present for every action. Even with multiple observers, I could feel the crate reacting to us, pulsating with a presence I couldn't name. Following Rule 9, never attempt to move a crate without backup, felt like holding a fragile tether between control and chaos. Luis stepped closer to assist me, his movements deliberate, and I could feel a subtle vibration running through his body, reflecting in the deck. The crate's metallic surface seemed to quiver in response, almost sentient, as if testing the limits of the rule. I realized that even the act of observation could influence its behavior, that our combined attention was part of the safeguard. The supervisor muttered that crews who tried to move crates alone often never returned to recount the consequences. The vibration grew slightly stronger, pulsing rhythmically through the deck, as if the crate was testing us. A sudden hum ran along the metal beams overhead, synchronized with the vibrations beneath our feet. I glanced at the nearest unassigned crate, noticing subtle ripples along its surface that suggested awareness. The shadows inside twisted unnaturally, reflecting movements that hadn't occurred, bending toward our direction. I reminded myself silently that Rule 9, never attempt to move a crate without backup, wasn't just about safety. It was about ensuring whatever resided in the crate didn't exploit weakness. Mark's shadow moved in tandem with the hum, as if signaling a warning. The supervisor instructed us to secure a secondary line for the crate we were assigned, ensuring that any unexpected movement could be controlled. Every subtle vibration seemed magnified, resonating in my chest, as though the crate could feel hesitation and uncertainty. Even the smallest lapse in coordination could trigger a reaction, I realized, and the crate's shadows stretched toward any gap in our vigilance. I tightened my grip on the cable lock, forcing myself to move deliberately, acutely aware that Rule 9 existed because isolation was deadly when interacting with these crates. Luis flinched as a faint metallic scrape echoed across the deck from an unassigned crate. The vibration intensified, sending a shiver up my spine, and I noticed the shadows twist unnaturally in rhythm with the sound. The supervisor instructed us to maintain proximity, emphasizing that distance could be fatal. I could see Mark's shadow elongating again, reaching toward the crate, and I understood that the crate didn't act randomly. It acted strategically, especially when it detected solo movements. Rule 9, never attempt to move a crate without backup, suddenly felt like the difference between existing and being consumed. As we prepared to move the assigned crate with proper backup, the vibration became almost unbearable, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. The shadows inside the crate writhed, extending along the deck, testing our coordination. I kept my focus, glancing only at the crate and my partner, ignoring all other stimuli. The supervisor's voice remained steady, a lifeline, guiding every movement. I realized then, with chilling clarity, that Rule 9 wasn't merely a rule, it was a shield, fragile and vital, keeping the crate's attention from exploiting any single lapse in judgment. Finally, with synchronized movements, we adjusted the crate slightly, and the vibration subsided marginally, as though satisfied with our compliance. But the shadows and the hum remained, a constant reminder that the crate's presence was patient, calculating and intelligent. Mark's shadow pressed against the glass silently, observing a sinister witness to our cautious obedience. I exhaled quietly, realizing that the rule had preserved our lives this time, but the next test was waiting, lurking in the unseen mechanisms of the crates. By the time the crate finally settled into place, exhaustion hit me all at once, heavy and unavoidable. My body begged for rest, muscles aching from hours of tension and forced stillness. But the supervisor's expression told me that wasn't an option. He didn't need to explain why Rule 10 never sleep, while the crates are active existed, because I could already feel it in the air around us. The deck felt alert, watchful, as if the rig itself was waiting for someone to close their eyes first. I leaned against the railing and realized how dangerous that urge to rest had suddenly become. The crew was ushered into the control section overlooking the deck, where we could still see every crate through reinforced windows. The lights inside were dimmer, warmer, and that made it worse, because comfort became the real enemy. Luis rubbed his eyes and joked weakly that 10 minutes wouldn't hurt anyone, but his voice cracked halfway through. I noticed his reflection in the glass lagged slightly behind his movements, and that alone kept me awake. Whatever was inside those crates didn't need darkness to act, only inattention. Mark's shadow still lingered outside, pacing slowly along the edge of the glass like it had nowhere else to go. I couldn't see his face anymore, just the outline stretching and compressing unnaturally as the deck lights shifted. Every time one of us blinked too long, the shadows inside the crates seemed to reorganize, subtle but unmistakable. The supervisor ordered caffeine tablets distributed, his hands shaking just enough to betray how serious this was. I swallowed mine dry, already feeling the dull ache behind my eyes deepen. As the night dragged on, the fatigue became something physical, like pressure behind my forehead, trying to push me down. The chair beneath me felt too comfortable, the hum of machinery too steady, too lulling. I caught myself nodding once, and snapped upright immediately, heart racing. In that brief dip of awareness, I had the distinct impression that the crates had leaned closer to the windows. I didn't tell anyone, because fear spreads faster when spoken aloud. Luis wasn't as lucky. I noticed his head drooping slowly, chin sinking toward his chest as he stared at the deck. I reached out and shook him hard, harder than necessary, and he startled awake with a sharp gasp. He looked confused, then terrified, pointing at the glass and asking when the crates had moved. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop, because one of them was now aligned perfectly with our window, when it hadn't been before. The supervisor ordered everyone to stand. No sitting, no leaning, no closing eyes. Time stopped behaving normally after that. Minutes stretched too long, then collapsed into nothing, and my thoughts began looping in uncomfortable ways. I kept thinking about sleep, about how easy it would be to let go just for a moment. That was when I noticed the reflections in the glass no longer matched our positions at all, showing some of us slumped, eyes closed, even though we were standing. I forced myself to keep moving, pacing back and forth, clenching and unclenching my fists to stay grounded. The crates responded to fatigue more than anything else. The more exhausted we became, the more active the shadows inside them grew, sliding along the interior surfaces like they were testing limits. The supervisor muttered that sleep wasn't rest here, it was permission. I believed him, because every time my thoughts blurred, I felt a subtle pull toward the deck, like something inviting me to lie down and stop resisting. Mark's shadow pressed flat against the glass again, its outline no longer human, as if it had already accepted that invitation. At some point, one of the control lights flickered, and I instinctively glanced away from the deck for half a second. When I looked back, a crate was closer, not by much, but enough that the difference couldn't be denied. My pulse spiked, and I realized the crates weren't moving all at once, only when they weren't being fully perceived. Staying awake wasn't about consciousness, it was about awareness. The moment awareness dipped, they advanced. The supervisor ordered constant verbal check-ins, forcing us to speak, move, react, anything to prove we were still present. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, like it was coming from farther away than it should. Luis kept repeating his name like an anchor, while I focused on describing objects in the room to keep my mind from drifting. Outside, the deck lights reflected off the crates in sharper angles, their surfaces no longer smooth but subtly distorted, like they were pressing outward. I realized then that the crates didn't need us asleep to act, they needed us close to it. Sleep was simply the fastest way to surrender control. My legs shook from exhaustion, and my vision blurred at the edges, but I stayed upright, forcing my body to obey even as my mind frayed. The supervisor met my eyes and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that this rule was breaking us slowly on purpose. And as the night deepened, I understood with terrifying clarity that the final rule wouldn't test our awareness at all. It would test what happened after we ran out of it. The first light of dawn barely penetrated the fog over the rig, and yet the deck felt heavier than ever, as if the very air was saturated with unspoken menace. I leaned against the railing, muscles trembling, exhausted beyond reason, knowing that Rule 11, never assume you are safe, even when all rules are followed, was the one that haunted every other rule we had obeyed. Each crate lay in its assigned place, sealed and locked, yet the vibrations beneath my boots pulsed subtly, irregularly, as if testing whether I truly understood what obedience meant. Mark's shadow lingered on the other side of the glass, elongated and twisting in ways that defied reality, reminding me that nothing on this rig, or in these crates, was ordinary. The supervisor and I moved carefully along the deck, inspecting each crate one last time, still wary of subtle shifts in their metallic surfaces. Every crack of metal, every reflection, made me flinch, because we knew that even when rules were followed perfectly, the crates were never truly dormant. I caught my reflection in the steel of one crate, and it was wrong. The eyes staring back at me weren't mine, at least not entirely. I swallowed hard, thinking of all the rules, every instance we had nearly faltered, and realized that Rule 11, never assume you are safe, even when all rules are followed, meant vigilance wasn't optional. It was the only thing keeping the entities at bay. Mark's shadow moved independently, stretching impossibly toward the crates, though his physical body hadn't shifted an inch. I knew from the vibration in the deck, and the subtle pulse in the crates, that they were aware of him, aware of us, aware of everything we thought was controlled. I could hear the faint hum of machinery, or maybe something else, echoing in a pattern that seemed deliberate, a silent reminder that safety was a perception, not a guarantee. Every completed rule, every moment of obedience, had delayed the inevitable, but had not nullified it. The supervisor whispered that past crews, who thought they had survived every rule, discovered too late that compliance was temporary. I could feel the weight of that warning pressing against my chest as I traced the locks on the crates again, noting each cable, hinge and latch. Even though nothing seemed immediately threatening, the shadows within the crates twisted subtly, forming vague shapes that resembled fingers, faces, and figures we could not identify. Rule 11, never assume you are safe, even when all rules are followed, wasn't just a reminder. It was a warning that no procedure could grant immunity. A low, resonant vibration pulsed through the deck beneath us, sharper this time, carrying a subtle rhythm that seemed to mirror our own heartbeats. I froze, realizing the crates had synchronized with our fear and fatigue, acknowledging every decision we had made in obedience to the previous 10 rules. I glanced at Luis, who was pale and sweating, whispering that he thought the crates were learning. I didn't answer, because Rule 11 was not about discussion. It was about understanding that survival was never final, and control was an illusion. The shadows twisted more aggressively now, pressing closer to the glass, as if the crates were testing boundaries, probing for any hint of overconfidence. I realized that the moment we assumed our compliance meant safety, we had already invited scrutiny. The supervisor signaled to keep moving, never pausing, and I understood why the crates could exploit hesitation as easily as carelessness. My body screamed for rest, for any relief, but Rule 11, never assume you are safe, even when all rules are followed, reminded me that surrendering for even a moment could be fatal. Outside, Mark's shadow elongated unnaturally, stretching toward each crate in turn, fingers curling around edges that didn't exist. I felt a prickling along my spine, a visceral acknowledgement that the presence inside the crates wasn't bound by metal or rule. It existed in perception, in the spaces between, in the attention we paid. Every breath, every blink, every movement was under silent observation. Even obedience itself was a test, and I understood that Rule 11 was not a safeguard, but a statement of relentless vigilance. Nothing could be trusted. The hum intensified, subtle but omnipresent, echoing in a rhythm that seemed almost alive. I watched the crate's reflections shift across the deck in ways that didn't correspond to our positions, forming impossible angles and phantom shapes. My throat tightened, and I realized that even as the rules were followed, the entities were still there, patient, waiting, testing. I whispered to myself, "We obeyed everything, but that doesn't mean we're safe," the words barely audible over the hum. The supervisor motioned for us to retreat to the control room, but the pull of the crate's presence remained, heavier than it had been at any point during the night. Each vibration, each distorted reflection, reminded me that Rule 11, never assume you are safe, even when all rules are followed, was a rule without exceptions. Compliance had delayed disaster, but it had not ended it. The crates were patient, aware, and they had learned from us. As we entered the control room, I looked back at the deck, at the crates sitting silently, deceptively inert. The supervisor exhaled quietly and whispered, "We survived for now." But I knew, with a cold certainty, that Rule 11 meant survival was temporary, conditional, and that the entities inside the crates were far from finished. Even in obeying all the rules, we were still under observation, and the moment we relaxed, we would pay the price. I leaned against the console, eyes fixed on the crates, knowing the rig's pulse. Their pulse was relentless. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.